Hello and good evening, and welcome to the Business of Property. I am your host, Cheryl Leong from Property Development Australia. So I begin by acknowledging our traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. At the Business of Property, we interview superstar guests in the property space that share their expertise, their deals, their stories to help empower, build, and grow our community of property investors and developers. So, hello to Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube land. Give me a shout out if you're here with us today in the comments section, and if you're watching the replay, hashtag replay as well. So, we're going to be speaking to two very distinguished guests who are veterans in the property industry, particularly as buyer's agents. So, we've got Pete Wargent, who is co founder of Australia's first national property buyers agency portal, BuyersBuyers, and also Rich Harvey, who is has been in the space and be a buyer's agent for over 20 years, has seen a few property cycles and has a bit of an idea about what's happening in the property space, and hence why I've invited them as guests to talk about, the topic around the stamp duty reform. So, without further ado, let's bring them onto the Property Development Australia Business of Property platform. Hello, Pete. Hello, Rich. How are we doing today?
Very good. Thanks for having us on the show.
No, great to have you here. So, I'll start with Rich, if you wouldn't mind, Pete. Rich,
okay.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and I guess your experience in summary in the property space. So for those of you who haven't seen or heard of you before.
Sure. Well, I've been running Property Buyer, which is my company, for 21 years this year. So we're celebrating with a birthday cake. And I was just saying to you off air, we've just done a complete rebrand. So we're just launching a new look and feel to the market. I was one of the original buyers agents in Australia. Started in Sydney, and we've now got operations in all the on the East Coast, Melbourne, Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, Newcastle, Central Coast as well. My background, I actually started life as an economist. Did that for about 10 years. I wanted to save the environment, save the world. So I worked and trained as an environmental economist. Did a lot of work on Sydney's air and water pollution controls and helped to clean up our beaches. And when I was doing that, I got a bit sick of doing it and started buying properties and realized I could help people achieve their dreams and replace their incomes. And hence, that's when I started my business. So here I am, 21 years later. Got a team of 26 and loving what we do every day.
Fantastic, Rich. And over to you, Pete. Tell us a little bit about particularly buyers as well.
Yeah, so we were just chatting before we came on. I started in Sydney as a buyer's agent 12 years ago. And at the time, there weren't that many people doing it. So there was Rich, obviously, was one of the pioneers of the industry in Australia. And there was also maybe half a dozen other active buyer's agents or well-known buyer's agents. Obviously, the industry has grown a lot since then, partly thanks to people like Rich. These days, I run a buyer's agent network. So we've got a national coverage. And I've also been a buyer's agent in London as well. So we have some international experience. So, hopefully between us, we've got some good information that we can cover off for you today.
Fabulous. Thank you. So the topic of today is stamp duty reforms and what it means for you. I mean, our audience out there, people in the property space. And why I wanted to bring the two of you on board. One, Rich is very active, obviously, in New South Wales, in the Sydney market. And Pete, you're in Queensland, but I'd like to be able to have your thoughts as to where you think this is, what the impact is, one, and what this is mean for buyers. And two, what are the potential repercussions as well? I mean, we don't have a shiny future silver ball type thing, but again, seeing about different reforms that have happened throughout the decades, where do you think this is probably taking us? Maybe we start off. What are the reforms? Who would like to? Who's done their homework? What are the reforms?
I can run you through the legislation. So basically, from middle of January next year, first home buyers in New South Wales will actually have the option for the first time to either pay stamp duty up front or to pay an annual property tax, effectively a land tax. But this is only on properties up to a value of 1.5 million, or vacant land of $800,000. So they've been talking about this for a number of years, but in the end, they've kind of squibbed it a little bit because it's only going to apply to first-time buyers in the first instance. So look, there is some opportunity there, particularly for first-time buyers wanting to get into the market, also for investors, because there's going to be some arbitrage between now and January. There's some real opportunities in that sub $1.5 million price bracket. I guess the bigger picture and what we can come on to talk about is if they get this up and running successfully, New South Wales presumably will roll this out across all properties in due course if they can get federal support. And then if New South Wales is successful, it will get replicated in other states down the track, because I think a lot of governments have been eyeing up a way to switch away from lumpy stamp duty to a very smooth and predictable annual land tax.
Yeah. Rich, who do you think are the winners and losers in this?
So, yeah, there's a couple of pros and cons and winners and losers out of this, Cheryl. So I think, number one, it's going to help first home buyers, or if they do roll it out to other buyers, it'll definitely reduce the transaction cost, which is a huge impediment to anyone buying a property. You know, on $1 million property in New South Wales, it's $42,000 of tax that you pay for what? A rubber stamp saying you purchased a property. Hey, well done, great. You know, and it's been indexed, you know, over the years. So it's just the amount's gone up and up and up. And we make a joke, you know, economists make a joke that the government's addicted to it like crack cocaine, you know. So, and any sort of change that the government wants to do in any kind of tax, they want revenue neutrality, which means if they're going to lose one revenue source, they've got to get it from another way. So it's not the abolition of stamp duty, it's rebadging the way this duty and this tax is collected. So instead of collecting it all up front, they're having a smaller amount collected on an annual basis. So I think one of the benefits is for first home buyers trying to get into the market, it reduces one massive barrier to entry, which is stamp duty. It's almost like you've got to save a double deposit to get into the market. You know, on $1 million property, there's 40 grand gone like that. So, so reducing that upfront cost. I think the other benefit is that it helps to encourage turnover or transactions in the market. You know, stamp duty is a bit of an anti-green tax. Like, it should make labour mobile. Like, if you need to move house because you changed job or whatever reason, you should be able to sell your home and not have to have all these huge transaction costs. So it really is an impediment to people transacting property. So it should improve that. So I think that's good. One point I will make is that there is sort of what we call an inflection point. So you've got to decide whether you pay it up front or whether you pay it down the track on an annual basis. So I think most investors will just pay it on an annual basis because it makes a lot of sense. It's, you know, it's a tax deduction. But for the home buyer, there could be a point where it actually, if you're going to hold the property for 20 years or more, then there could be a case for actually paying it up front, because probably, I think I did the numbers, and Pete, you might chime in on this, but I think it's about year 12 or 13 or 14, at which point you actually end up paying more as an annual tax than you would have if you paid it up front. But you do have to come up with that lump sum.
Yeah, and so that's one of the questions that's popped up. It says, in the long run, will it be more than stamp duty? And so I guess what you're saying, Rich, is that, well, it depends on how long you're going to live in the property.
Correct.
I guess.
Yeah, it really just depends on your time horizon.
Yeah, no, so look, if you're buying a property for, let's say $700,000, the upfront stamp duty is only about 10 grand. And the land tax, because there's an annual amount that you have to pay, $400 plus the 0.3% land tax, $1,600 per annum. So look, the inflection point comes sooner for those lower value properties. And I guess the risk is it's effectively a forever tax on a forever home. That's what that's why people have always hated the idea of a switch to a land tax, and why it's been politically so unpopular. Because as we've discovered in Queensland over the years, those land values, they never get revalued down. They're only going one direction. And I think the other thing is, what's to stop a future government who's a bit short on its budget deficit from increasing that annual land tax from say 0.3% to 0.35 or 0.5? There's nothing you can do. You've got no control over that. So these are the things that have made it unpopular, because in Australia we don't have things like reverse mortgages. They're not very common at all. So people have always said, well, what about the old lady in a 5-bedroom house having to pay the annual land tax. But
Yeah.
look, it will take a long time to phase in. This is only first home buyers, and it's still optional. So those are issues for way down the track, I think.
And so, what are the implications? Because if you're an investor, you do pay land tax at the moment. So, is it a double land tax, or how does that practically happen?
Well, the proposal is only for first home buyers at this stage, so it doesn't for investors. There's no sort of impact on the investor, but it will have an impact on market dynamics, though, and you can almost guarantee. And Rich is probably seeing it already. Investors saying, "Well, hang on, maybe I should be buying a unit in Sydney, in that sort of 1 million price bracket, or even a house in the Central Coast or at Wollongong, because there's going to be no doubt first home buyers from January going to the bank of mum and dad and say, look, no stamp duty. Can you help me get into the market with a deposit? Because the actual hurdle has come down by about 1/3 now.
That's right. Yeah, I think the thing to point out too, Cheryl, is land tax is applied at different rates in different states. I forget the actual. I should know the number off the top of my head in New South Wales, but I think it's 750,000 is the minimum, whatever the number is, Pete. Forget. But you pay land tax at 1.6% above whatever the land value is.
Yeah.
If you own a property in a trust or a company name, then there's no threshold. But if you own it as an individual, then the aggregated value of all your properties is added together, and they calculate land tax that way. So it is, and when you're doing an investment, and if you are buying a portfolio of properties, it's really important to consider the impost of land tax on your overall return. A lot of people forget to register, and then they get a nasty surprise 3 or 4 years down the track when the ATO does data matching and said, oh, hello, you've got a property. Did you not register? And then you get 3 years worth of land tax plus a fine. So just be careful for that.
Yeah. And so have you seen more interest from first home buyers reaching out to you to say, one, Rich Pete actually can afford something more expensive now?
Yeah, there's been a bit more activity, absolutely, at the lower price points. Definitely. I get interviewed by journalists all the time, and the day before the budget came out, they wanted 3 or 4 examples, and we gave them a couple of clients we'd recently helped, and the client said, I wish we'd known this, and we could have taken it, but where the price point that they bought at wouldn't have really mattered that much. But yeah, we are definitely seeing more inquiry, and I think you're going to see more inquiry as the year progresses, because the market's corrected and will reach a plateau at some point, and I think people will go, actually, here's another window of opportunity to actually buy a property, and catch the market. Like, the market raced ahead last year. I've never seen in my career, prices rise so quickly, so fast. It's unbelievable. But equally, this year, I haven't seen a market pull back so quickly either. It's been quite a remarkable dynamic. But definitely, to your point, Cheryl, yeah, we'll definitely see more inquiry as the year progresses.
Yeah, someone's made a comment here. South Australia doesn't charge stamp duty on commercial investments, which definitely draws buyers. Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the arguments for investing in New Zealand back in the day was you didn't get clobbered with the big stamp duty. I mean, as Rich already alluded to, sometimes there is a downside to that. The upside is the economy should get a growth dividend, because people can move to where their jobs are. The labour force is much more mobile. And I guess when you've got 423,000 job vacancies, that's got to be a good thing, that people can move to where their jobs are. That's great for the New South Wales economy. But it does mean as well there'll be more flipping, potentially. If you bring in, over time, you bring in a land tax and you don't have the stamp duty as a frictional cost, then now initially it's going to be just first home buyers. But if it gets rolled out across the board, well, investors are going to start looking at it saying, well, maybe I can do a renovation and sell the property on at a profit, because the stamp duty won't be the frictional cost anymore.
Yeah. And do you think it's also the government, the New South Wales government's way of trying to keep first home buyers in New South Wales, because it's on affordability? They're sort of going, all right, well, if I give them this sort of bonus, no stamp duty, because let's be honest, like, it was getting up to $1 million an average Sydney price, which has dropped back a little bit. So you sort of go, first home buyer, what can I afford in New South Wales?
Yeah, there's a bit of that. I think the other thing is, as Rich said, from a tax point of view, well, the government, as Rich was just touching on there before. The New South Wales government has just had an enormous windfall from stamp duty, about $15 billion across the financial year. So if ever there was a time to say, right, well, let's try to get people opting out of stamp duty and onto a land tax, now is the time to do it. One of the arguments against stamp duty was always, well, it's a massively cyclical tax. And during a boom, the government's coffers are running over. But then you go into a slow period like we've been in since the election. And then suddenly the stamp duty's dried up and the government's looking around for tax revenue. So the idea with the land tax, of course, is that it's much more predictable and much smoother through the cycle.
Yeah. And so where do you think, I mean, Rich sort of highlighted briefly, we've got a bit of a correction here, but then you've introduced this sort of reform. Is it the intention that it's meant to sort of bolster the market and bring it up again?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, the government doesn't really want to bolster the market one way or the other. They simply want to bring equity and fairness and provide an avenue for affordability. I mean, the state governments control land supply through their policies, and they can have a huge impact on what developers get charged, what councils charge, and really impact land supply. So I think in terms of their policy, they definitely want to, for the general public, keep housing relatively affordable. But the forces of supply and demand will always play out. And I think this stamp duty reform is a good one. I think it's a necessary thing. It's a bit like, remember when the GST came in, everyone was saying, oh, it's a stupid tax. Actually, from an economic point of view, it's quite an efficient tax. Taxing people at the point of consumption is a good idea. And the more you consume, the more tax you pay. In a property sense, there's got to be the principles of equity and fairness applied to property taxes too. Everyone might think they have a right to own a property, but at the end of the day, you've got to pay the price to own a property. The government's not giving out land for free. It's not like we're all just arrived from convict ships and they're handing, land allocation out left, right, and centre. That horse is well and truly bolted. But I think the government definitely wants to have a position where first home buyers can have some better way of getting a leg up into the market.
I've got a question for you, Rich, because you being Sydney based, do you think if a land tax gets ramped up over time, do you think that might drive more of a tilt towards units and apartment living? Because I guess since 2017 in Sydney and Melbourne, units haven't really kept up with house prices. But I guess one of the things is people haven't been at all keen to downsize because, they're, even in their retirement years, they're looking at it and saying, yeah, but if I have to sell my property and then pay a massive stamp duty to buy the unit or apartment or townhouse to retire into. But if that hurdle is eventually removed, I guess this is the whole idea, right? We make a more optimal use of the dwelling stock. Do you think that might sort of tilt things towards apartments?
Yeah, I agree. I agree with the sentiment of your question, Peter. Definitely. I think if the government could bring in incentives to reduce that barrier for older people to move out of their homes and for younger people to move into properties, I mean, the pricing of properties will dictate and the borrowing capacity will dictate what you can afford. And I think during COVID, I think we've shied away more from units. I mean, CoreLogic put out some data that I saw Eliza Owen put up not long ago, and it's showing that we've really tended to want to move to lower density living. But I think that trend will be reversed over time as prices then, start to increase again, and we'll start to move back toward lower price properties, apartments and townhouses. But basically affordability will drive that market. So I think the stamp duty reform, I think, is a good thing to help make that accessibility for buyers that can't afford top end properties. I mean, the Sydney median house price got up to 1.4, 1.5 million during COVID, and it's coming back a bit off that now. But that's a pretty major price to pay if you're buying your first home.
Yeah, I went down to Brisbane at the weekend. I was catching up with a family who I know who live literally in Brisbane CBD on Queen Street. And there's four of them who live in a unit. They've come from Iran, so it's relatively more common for them to sort of live in a bustling city environment. They were saying through COVID, they live on level 62 on Queen Street, but the lift was practically out of action because you could only have two people per lift, and there's only so many lifts. So
Oh my
when you look at it
goodness.
through that lens, it's no coincidence, or it's not that surprising, I guess, that people have just said, well, CBD living is not very practical in a pandemic. And I guess Rich would have seen, no doubt, the inquiry for people wanting to move to the Central Coast or
No, they've all
South
gone to your
Coast.
area, Pete. They've all gone north to the Sunshine Coast. That's where they've all ended up, right?
There's a lot of blow-ins at the moment, including me, of course, as a Brit. But it's you can see it's certainly coastal properties performed extraordinarily well over the past 2 years because living in a CBD unit where you can't use the lift, I mean, that's just that is something that you talk about black swan events and things that weren't predictable, but that was a real difficulty for some people.
The other point to make on that, Pete, is the type of dwelling that people have preferred. Obviously, with COVID, everybody wants a home office, and people haven't been able to have the space, and they've got frustrated, or they've got 3 kids and they're driving them around the bend when they're trying to do Zoom meetings, and they've gone, this is just not working. And so they've desperately reached out for help to get bigger digs. And that's what's happened. People have upgraded their nests. A lot of what we call feathering the nest has gone on, and people have moved out and bought bigger properties.
Well,
feathering the nest, that's the first one I've heard. That's the first time I've heard that. Everyone's, flying the coop and all. But I do see lots of people in terms of people upgrading during the COVID times, particularly during COVID times, because they were like, I can't handle this lockdown with children. I need to get out of my little shoebox for some space.
I suppose I had a follow-up question there, Rich, and that is we've seen just in the past 3 or 4 months that more people are selling up in Noosa, Sunshine Coast, those kind of areas, and houses are selling much more slowly than they were. But are you seeing any trend towards people moving back towards Sydney? Because clearly there was the census figures.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean the ABS had census figures and population figures out today, and interstate migration to Queensland, particularly southeast Queensland, was over 50,000 last year. It's literally never been that high, not even in the mining investment go-go years. But I'm just wondering whether some of those COVID refugees are now sort of being called back to the office in Sydney and Melbourne. I've seen, it's anecdotal. I've seen 1 or 2 examples, but I'd be interested to hear.
Yeah, we certainly haven't had a flood of inquiries from people that are, as you call them, COVID refugees. I think it's more, as you say, anecdotal. I mean, we've had friends of ours that moved to Tasmania thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be beautiful, and then realised how flippin' cold it is down there, and sold up and moved back to Sydney 6 months later. So I think the reality or the dream is different to the reality for some people, where they might go to the sunny coast or the Newcastle or Sunshine Coast or wherever they go, and then get there and realise I'm really missing my friends, or I'm really missing my family, or actually I'm missing collaborating with my work colleagues. And I think it's probably a bit early to call that trend. I did get called by a journalist the other day on exactly that question, looking for evidence of that. I would say it's not widespread, but I think it's one to watch. And I think, depending on what companies issue as an edict for their workforce and say, look, you've got to be in the office for 2 days a week, 3 days a week, or 5 days a week, depending on which company you're with, that's going to determine whether that dynamic plays out, Pete. I've been spending
a bit of time in Sydney at a couple of the major banks, and the office is still 80% empty. Every second desk is sort of left vacant for COVID, and the major banks haven't really sent people back into the office yet. And of course, in a financial services capital like Sydney, that's a huge employer. If the big 4 banks start bringing people back into the office, I think that could start to see things reverse potentially.
Well, we talk to a lot of bankers and financial planners and whatever, and whenever I'm talking to the senior bankers, they're all working from home, and they're only going into the office for social engagements or 1 or 2 days a week max. I mean, with my staff, we were already half of us working from home anyway, because a lot of us are working remote. For my wife, who works in not-for-profit, they require them in the office between 2 to 3 days a week, and that's purely for collaboration purposes. So I think it depends on what industry you're working in as to where that policy will go. I definitely think there'll be a trend to migrating back more into the office. Probably 3 days a week will be the happy medium. So I think, it could be Monday, Tuesday, you work from home, or whatever. They're going to have certain collaboration days.
Yeah.
And that will also bring a dynamic to the commute and to traffic and people moving back toward the cities. But I think the romance of always living really remotely, I think will wear off to some degree over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think people got a little bit comfortable, and then they went. They just sort of stuck in their UGG boots, particularly in the cold. But I am seeing that either one, like I said, office, businesses are asking people to come back, or people just sort of go, actually, it's easier for me to talk to others. We've got a few questions and comments here. From the developer's point, if they have to pay land tax, won't they be increasing their costs? And I understand. Well, land tax you do have to pay if you're a developer holding an investment property anyhow. So that theoretically should be included into your feasibility anyway. I don't think there's any additional.
There's no change at this point.
There's no change there. If a developer buys a property, they've just got to pay the tax. There's no change in the tax regime for that. No.
Yeah. And there's a comment here. I'm old enough to remember the Great Migration from Melbourne and Sydney to Southeast Queensland during the 89 to 91 recession. And I think over half of them ended up back at home within a few years. Well, that's interesting because I guess at the time, technology as well didn't quite allow for really working remotely, where it's
one of the big differences now. Because if you think back to the early 90s recession, those would have been the days of Ansett. I think that was even before Virgin Blue. I think the thing is now you can jump on the plane at Maroochydore and I can be at my desk in Sydney by 9 o'clock really easily. And I can even do a day trip to Sydney. It doesn't cost a lot. I mean, it does make for a very long day. But yeah, I mean, travel is a lot more, it's a lot cheaper and more accessible than it used to be. You'd be surprised, on Monday, getting a plane from Maroochydore to Sydney. There's a lot of people doing it now. They just slip the thongs off when they arrive in Sydney and try and look semi-professional. But it's the flights that have got cheaper. I guess that's the big difference. It used to be quite punitive, but now you can do day trips relatively easy.
So we're actually, just to that point, you asked a question before, Pete, which is related to this question. We actually are getting some clients that are buying a bolt hole in Sydney, and then they've got their other property either in the Sunshine Coast or Newcastle or mid-north coast somewhere. So we are seeing a bit of that. And as you say, because the flights are cheaper, but obviously the airports are a nightmare at the moment because they're still short-staffed and you got to get there 3 hours before your flight, if it's going on time, that is. So there's obviously a few wheels that need to get really moving. But yeah, it definitely travels a lot cheaper. But I think also a lot of people moved back because the jobs were obviously paying a lot better in Sydney and Melbourne back in that time. And now we have a situation where you can earn a high-paying job and work remotely, and it's still okay. And that I think will continue. There's going to be a great war for talent again over the next couple of years until our unemployment rate, goes up again and migration really comes in. So I think you'll see a lot of people trying to get the best of both worlds, collaborating with their colleagues, as you say, coming to Sydney for a couple of days a week or Melbourne, and then coming home for the rest of the week.
Yeah, I've heard some of the tech employers, the big employers in tech, sort of cutting edge startups and so on, they're basically having to allow staff to work from home because there just isn't the availability of skills at the moment. So the bargaining power is all in favour of the employees at the moment. So if you're in a STEM career where you can work in a home office, I think a lot of people have sort of based themselves at Brisbane, Gold Coast, Sunshine Coast, probably Byron, Central Coast as well. I had a question for you, Rich, on I was just casting my mind back to Sydney in 2017 when there was the credit squeeze and then we had the Banking Royal Commission, and there was all this sort of debate in the media about daily housing prices that, there was like this smooth glide lower. But when I was going to auctions, it was like prices changed 10% overnight. And I'm assuming there's something similar there at the moment, where in the media they're talking about, in the month of June, prices will be down 1.27% or whatever. But I'm assuming that those figures are yesterday's news and you're picking up some properties a bit cheaper now.
Oh, absolutely. CoreLogic report that the Sydney median house price is down 2.6% for the quarter. That's 3 months out of date. right? And literally 3 months out of date, because settlement periods are 42 days. That's a month and a half.
Yeah.
And even on the ground, like we're seeing price falls of somewhere between 10 to 15% already. I mean, properties like I live on the northern beaches of Sydney. I was trying to buy for clients at around 2.4, 2.5, and it was so competitive. So that property that was 2.5, I can now pick it up, with a bit of tough, heavy negotiation for about 2.1, 2.15,
Wow.
So really significant discount in the market. And when I go to open homes, instead of there being a queue of 20 people out the door, you'd be lucky if you see 3 couples there. So it's really changed dramatically. So you're quite right, Pete. The data is very much out of date, and it shouldn't be driving decision making. So I think one of the messages for any potential buyer out there is everyone's trying to pick the absolute perfect time to buy. And I'll say you'll never pick it, right? If you wanted to pick the best time to sell, look back to October last year. That was the peak of the market, right? October last year. We had a friend that I recommended to an agent to sell. They had a house in Belrose that I thought would probably get, maybe just over the 3 million mark. They sold for 3.7, unbelievable. 10 bidders, just went for a fantastic price. They got absolutely blessed, and they moved to Melbourne for work purposes. But, you'd never get that price today, So it's very much the taps turned off, and the demand has really dropped significantly.
Yeah. And Rich, at the moment we've got really, really low unemployment rates, and the rental market's so tight. People are earning decent money, and I sort of think from an economics point of view, what's really, is it mainly market settlement that's really pulled things back? Because everything else seems to be powering forward to indicate, we're earning more money. Like I said, people are being offered, like people in jobs are being offered ridiculous prices because you can't find enough people, enough skilled labor. So what are your thoughts around that?
Well, it's really interesting you mentioned the word sentiment, Cheryl, because I'm writing my newsletter, which is going out next week, and I'll preempt it right now. It's good segue. If you look at the Westpac Melbourne Index, and they track consumer sentiment, pretty much on a weekly and monthly basis, and the latest figures show that it's slumped dramatically. So it was at 90 points. So 100 is where it's stable, where we're sort of a median point. And it's dropped from 90.4 to 84.6. So it's dropped 4.5% in June, right? So it's quite a downturn. So and the last time it got down during the GFC, it got down to 79. The 1990s recession, it got down to 64, right? So we are heading into sort of really negative sentiment. But it isn't. What I'm trying to say in my newsletter is that consumer sentiment just measures feelings. Right? It measures people's perspectives on the market. It doesn't measure actual data, but people will act based on what they feel or what they believe.
Yeah.
And this is a really important point to take home, is that people will act upon what they believe. And if you can, as a smart investor or smart developer, change your mindset, you can potentially beat the market. Like, you can't necessarily move the market, right? But you can use the market and this negative sentiment to your advantages. So I wrote down all the factors that are supporting the market, either they were holding prices up, and then I looked at all the factors that are pushing the market down. And I came up with 7 factors that are depressing prices, and I came up with, how many factors did I say? That 15 factors that are pushing the market up.
Yeah.
So I'll quickly run through them if you like.
Actually, that would be great. It's funny that you mentioned the mindset, because I was like, does everyone need a whole lot of Tony Robbins to be playing in their ear? Because I'm seeing all these, like I said, these factors, but I'd love for you to summarize that. I think it would be fantastic.
Sure. Well, I guess the key thing is the factors that are depressing property prices. Number one, it's rising interest rates, right? So no doubt interest rates are rising, but they haven't got to the highest level yet, right? We're only at 0.85% cash rate. You should be paying about 3% or 2.75% on your mortgage, right? We are going to see the cash rate rise. I think it'll settle somewhere around 2.5%, 2 to 2.5% cash rate, which will equate to around a 4.5% mortgage rate. Second thing we've talked about already, depressed consumer sentiment. Third negative factor is rising inflation, cost of living. So we're all paying more at the Bowser, all paying more for cos lettuce and a whole bunch of other factors.
$12 broccoli, yes.
Yeah, it's a nightmare, right? So grow your own veggies. the big factor that's really depressing the market is borrowing capacity. So people's borrowing capacity, as interest rates rise, borrowing capacity reduces. Now, I've asked this question to many, many mortgage brokers that we work with. And basically the underlying rule is that for every 1% increase in interest rates, you'll probably see around a 10% decline in borrowing capacity. So a lot of people don't realize that equation. So if you've got borrowing capacity, you've got 90 days to use it. And then you get reassessed and you're going to end up with a lower borrowing capacity. And what it can mean is that people can actually miss out on the opportunity to buy into the market well. Anyway, I'll come back to that point later. Another factor depressing prices is global share market uncertainty, the Ukraine war creating supply chain crunches. Another depressing factor is affordability constraints. Property prices are still high relative to people's income, that debt to servicing ratio. And lastly, we're also seeing in this post-COVID property boom, a correction in vendor expectations. Vendors are having to correct their expectations. So that's on the negative side. On the plus side, what are the factors that are kind of supporting or putting a floor under property prices? Number one is migration. We've got lots of problems in processing visas, but we should be getting at least 160,000 or plus migrants. Hopefully they can work out how to rubber stamp these visas a bit quicker and get the skilled migrants in the door and workers for cafes. Building approvals is the second one. Building approvals has gone lower. Now, what that means is that we're not building enough properties to keep up with demand. And if we're not building enough properties, then we're going to have a supply crunch. So we pretty much got to an equilibrium level a couple of years ago. We always had a deficit in property in Australia, and then the developers caught up, and now we're in the next phase where we're going to be actually going short again. Another big factor is listing volumes at 28% below the 5-year average. So 28% lower listing volumes overall. So that's a pretty significant. 4, we've got a growing economy. We're resilient. I think the growth rate is around 4.25% for this year, around 3% forward for next year. Low vacancy rates, massive rental increases. We're at 9% rental increases already this year. Low unemployment, strong household balance sheets. I'm just ripping through these. Strong household balance sheets. Borrowers are ahead on their mortgages. That's a big one. We've all got buffer, and people have paid ahead during the COVID period, which is great. APRA is still insisting on that 3% serviceability buffer to stress test mortgage rates, mortgage loans. Construction costs have risen dramatically. Now, what that means is that the replacement value of your home has gone up. So inherently, the value of your property has gone up as well. So a lot of people are actually not wanting to renovate or holding off doing building because they simply feel like they can't afford it. And then we've got the 2 federal government help to buy, the New South Wales, we're just talking about the first home buyer stamp duty. And the final factor is when the share market's crapping itself, people see property as a safe haven and a hedge against inflation.
Yeah, just going back to you talking about the value of the property. This is a public service announcement more than anything else. You should look at your insurance for your properties as well, because replacement value, if anything goes, poo, you're not replacing it at the price that you've probably insured it for. So have a look at that. So I mean, this is the part where we do have to be able to see if the question is, what's the next year going to look like? What are the next 2 years going to look like? And where's the confidence in going, property is still the place to be? Like you mentioned before, we're not going to be timing the market, but where do you see the opportunities are for buyers, like the clever buyers here?
I think on the timing point, Rich was mentioning rising interest rates there. I think that's the key thing. It's a sentiment thing. Loads of first home buyers have never seen an interest rate hike. And if you look at Bloomberg today, the financial markets are looking for a cash rate of above 3% by the end of the year. Now, as Rich said, I don't think we'll get there, but there's a lot of fear out there that, well, what happens if inflation takes off and we see high interest rates? Now, it looks increasingly likely to me that inflation isn't going to peak in Australia until the end of the year, Q4, because you've still got things like electricity costs and household power bills. They're going through the roof. Rents are going up, say, at maybe 20%. at an annual pace. And there's other things to flow through yet to the official figures, like, as you mentioned, lettuce and fuel and so on. Now, inflation is reported with a lag in Australia. So those Q4 figures won't be reported until February next year. So that's probably the end of the hiking cycle in my book. Look at all the commodity prices around the world. They went sky high, but now they're falling. So eventually you're going to start to see those high inflation figures falling away. And I think as soon as people realize that, firstly, the cash rate's not going to go much higher. And secondly, as Rich said, it's more of a sentiment thing. It's not like the cash rate's going to be high. It might be 2 to 3%. It's going to be higher than it is now. But the borrowing capacity thing is a real factor. But again, the Reserve Bank has shown most borrowers don't actually borrow the maximum amount that they can. Most borrowers actually are quite conservative because the market's mainly made up of home buyers. So I guess the biggest thing of all at the moment is just sentiment. People have read all the media articles about rising interest rates, runaway inflation. Before we know it, we'll be talking about rate cuts in 2023. In fact, the financial markets are already pricing cuts in the US. Australia, not yet, but give it a few months and a couple more 50 basis point hikes. It won't be long before people are seeing the terminal cash rate, which if I had to guess, 2.4 or 2.6 or something like that. We won't see high interest rates. They're just higher than they are now.
Yeah. I think the key is that if you live on a diet of negative media, you'll never do anything. But what I'm saying to all my clients or prospective clients is that borrowing capacity is absolutely a golden opportunity. If you've got the ability, you've got income, you've got earning capacity, and you've got borrowing capacity, use it or lose it. I mean, I'll give you a personal anecdote. I looked to refinance all my properties last year, managed to lock in a couple of fixed rates. I got one rate of 1.79%, hallelujah, for 2 years. That was the lowest rate I've ever paid in my life, so I'm locking that one in. And I locked in a couple of other ones at just around the 2% mark. So, but don't try and fix now, by the way. And this is not financial advice, but you've missed the boat. But what I'm saying is I've got that borrowing capacity, and I've just bought 2 properties in the last month. So I'm putting my money where my mouth is. And for me, I'm trying to time the cycle. I'm not trying to find the exact perfect time to buy. And, I bought a property, one for 2 million, one for 950. Now, the one for 2 million, I could have paid 50 grand too much, but I don't care. I'm holding this property for 20 years, putting a duplex on the back, getting some extra income. The other one, if I've paid 10 grand too much, I don't care. I don't think I have. I think I've paid the right price. And I'll stick a granny flat on that one to get extra income. So for me, I'm looking at the rental income that I'm getting from these properties, which I know will just astronomically rise and more than compensate what I'm going to be paying for in extra interest costs. So I think what the message for anyone out there is to do the maths, literally do the maths and actually work out that, yes, as Pete said, a lot of people haven't seen a situation of rate rises before. We're going through this situation which is sort of literally unprecedented, to overuse that word, of rate rises. But do the maths, do the calculations, and work out, hey, I can still afford to buy this property. Because if you then wait, a lot of people are doing the hold and wait approach, do nothing approach. And then when everyone realizes, interest rates have found a floor, the property market's found a floor, you're going to turn up to an auction and you're going to have 5 other people there instead of one other person or nobody there, right? So trying to buy when there's less competition is just a perfect time. So I just get annoyed when it's just such a good time to buy and no one's around buying. I'm going, happy days. It's great time.
Exactly. It's great buying opportunities. What does Warren Buffett say about fear and when everyone's greedy?
Be fearful when others are greedy and greedy when others are fearful.
That's it. So,
and buy your straw hats in winter, which is quite apt today because it's bloody freezing up here.
Yeah, exactly.
all good. And so just before we wrap up, and just from the both of you, in terms of where you're seeing the opportunities at the moment, if we're to look at Australia in its entirety, where would be your key picks, Pete and Rich?
Pete, you go first, mate.
Well, it really depends on the budget. I think we've done a fair bit of buying in Adelaide over the past year or so. Relative affordability has been high, and I don't think I've ever seen a rental market in a capital city as tight as Adelaide is at the moment. Maybe Hobart, actually, a few years ago. So, as Rich already said there, rents are going through the roof in some cases. I think there was a news article today or yesterday about a single room that somebody had just put a shower in. It was renting out for $400 a week. There's a huge amount of pressure, but I think it really depends on budget. If you've got the budget to buy a house, on a good block of land, that's usually the preferred option for most people at the moment. Plenty of regional markets have still got momentum, and if your budget's a bit higher, well, you might have a counter-cyclical opportunity in Sydney.
Yeah, I guess for us, like you say, Peter, it's not a one-size-fits-all, but Cheryl, there's lots of opportunities all over Australia. We think Melbourne is a good counter-cyclical opportunity. You are going to be getting lower yields typically in some of the areas, but for $750K, you can still buy a house in the Bayside areas. You probably get high 3%, but that's a really good long-term buy, 40, 50 minutes from the city. We really like Newcastle and the Central Coast. Again, really affordable, great lifestyle, and still within striking distance of Sydney. We really like Southeast Queensland. The Gold Coast has got some great opportunities, really good ones. The market's come back a bit there, so it's sort of taking a breather. Brisbane has great yields. We're typically getting around 4.5% to 5% yields in that market. Sunshine Coast is also excellent as well from a lifestyle perspective. Also Mid-North Coast, and then in Sydney as well. There's excellent opportunities, particularly for home buyers and long-term investors across all the markets in Sydney. So again, it just is, as I say, it's not a one-size-fits-all. It just depends on the client's objectives and goals and what they're looking to achieve.
Fantastic. Well, the message is pretty clear. Just keep buying.
If you can afford it. Don't overstretch yourself,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you both very, very much for your input, for sharing as well. Rich, I know you gave us a little bit of insight into your newsletter, but for anyone that wants to actually read the contents, how do they get onto that?
Yeah, sure. Just on my website, propertybuyer.com.au, and you can subscribe there. You put it up on the screen. Thank you. There's a whole bunch of other resources and free downloads you can get there. If you want to have a chat to my team, feel free to give us a ring. Thanks, Cheryl.
Fabulous. And for those of you who are looking for buyers agents in particular areas or whichever, Rich is obviously one of them, BuyersBuyers.com.au as well. And if you'd like to reach out to any of our esteemed guests, you've got Rich here at propertybuyer.com.au and Pete Wargent at BuyersBuyers.com.au. Fabulous. Thank you very much, gentlemen. And Pete, I'll hopefully see you in a few weeks. Might do some buying when we're up there. And Rich, we'll actually have to catch up in person one day soon.
Sounds great.
Awesome. You guys take care. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for another session of The Business of Property. Make sure you visit and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Business of Property. So type in YouTube, The Business of Property, where you can find all our past episodes. And if you found value in today's session and want more, hit the like button so you get notified when a new episode pops up. So till next time, stay safe, keep warm, and we'll see you again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Cheryl.